Today's speaker is Professor Angela Faulkner. She received her PhD from Notre Dame, and she has been here for really 20 years now, is that right? I don't know. What year did you start at BYU?
I first started BYU in 95.
So she has a great deal of experience as a professor here at BYU. Now, she teaches classes in the areas of medical ethics and bioethics and applied ethics, having to do with the human biological sciences, those sorts of things. But you should know that her dissertation is in political philosophy. I always like to point that out because we share an outlook there. What classes are you teaching this time?
This semester I'm teaching Philosophy 300, the writing class, and I'm teaching Philosophy 212, medical ethics.
So she often teaches a medical ethics class, and that's a nice class because, well, it's medical ethics, but it's also a place where we get an influx of students from outside of philosophy to come and learn some sort of ethical principles within their area of study. And she does medical ethics issues usually for the advanced writing class. And she's taught that about every other year, it seems. Have you taught it every year?
It hasn't been a set pattern, but I've taught it a lot.
It's a very nice presentation of the philosophical writing class. And next semester you are teaching?
Next semester I'm teaching medical ethics, and I'm also teaching Philosophy 413, which fills our ethics requirement. It's going to be on the philosophy of disability and the philosophy of vulnerability.
I've taken both for medical ethics classes. Love them both. They're great.
Well,
So there's an endorsement from Joseph. And we're going to put that online later. So today she's going to be talking to us about a very interesting topic, which is the Latter-day Saint view of the moral status of an embryo. So let's welcome our speaker.
Okay. So let me start off by doing what I'm always asking my students to do with their thesis defense essays. All the spoilers up front, right? So my thesis is that the Latter-day Saint view, or more provocatively views, the Latter-day Saint views of the moral status of the embryo. This is a unique view, it's a humble view, it's a very nuanced view. And I think the best way to learn about it is you'll see the first half of my presentation, the two halves of that are kind of disjunct. On the one hand, I'm talking a lot about in vitro fertilization, and then I'm talking about abortion. And I think looking at those two topics together, we can learn a lot about the Latter-day Saint view of the moral status of the embryo. So first of all, why is this view so unique? One thing I want to say about it is it's tempting when we look at topics like abortion to say, well, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has, should I wear a mic? I probably should.
All right.
I didn't think of that. I'd probably do it either way.
Yes.
Test. All right, so I think it's tempting on issues like abortion to say, well, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has a very conservative view of abortion. The Catholic Church has a very conservative view of abortion, and kind of lump them together and say, well, we're a church that has a conservative view of abortion, and kind of assume that we think what the Catholic Church thinks. The Catholic Church particularly, because if you've studied medical ethics at all, you know they're kind of the 800-pound gorilla, and they're not in a rude way, but gorilla doesn't sound good. So let me say they're the heavyweights. They're the heavyweights because In terms of religious sources for thinking about medical ethics, the Catholic Church is king in terms of their influence. One thing you may or may not know about the Catholic Church is often they have people who have trained as theologians and philosophers for many years. Famously, Pope John Paul II was actually a philosopher before he became the Pope, and then he wrote these encyclicals that if you read them, you might think, oh, a philosopher might have written this. It's very different from our church. And I don't want to say this is a bad difference, even though I'm a philosopher, I don't want to say this is a bad difference, but I think it's a difference worth noting, because we don't have any long books all about how, here is the whole philosophy of life, and this is why our church thinks this on abortion and on euthanasia and the whole, like in Evangelium Vitae. We just don't have anything like that. I mean, we have the scriptures, but they're not focused in the same way on medical ethics topics. So it's very different. The Catholic Church has several of these encyclicals that deal with medical ethics topics. They're very philosophical. They give lots of long explanations. We just don't have that. So it can be tempting, since they do have that and they give all these reasons for their views, it can be really tempting to say, well, they're conservative, we're conservative, we all think the same thing. That's a big mistake. Our views are distinct. Although we don't have pages and pages written about these things, we do have distinct views. And certainly what I'm talking about today, our view on the moral status of the embryo, I think it qualifies as a distinct view, recognizably different from the Catholic view, for example, on the moral status of the embryo. And of course, also very different from secular views. The views of the world, yeah, we're not there. So our view is a unique view. I also want to say that it's a humble view. Oh, let me jump ahead. Okay, so this slide right here, this is from 2005 when everyone was talking about stem cell research. And some prominent members of the church had suggested positions, and the church actually thought it was important enough. They did not want to let what some prominent members of the church had said to stand as the church's position. So they actually went to the effort of issuing on Newsroom a statement that said, we have no official position on the moment that human life begins. This is a really central moment, I think. If you're a Latter-day Saint and you're thinking about abortion, you're thinking about the status of the embryo, this statement was huge. This was 2005. They haven't taken it back. They haven't said, we now have a position. So did any of you go to one of those wards where they have everybody memorize the Articles of Faith? Can somebody say the one about reveal for us? Can you do that?
Now you're putting me on the spot and I feel nervous.
Okay, well, we'll just say no one else was nodding at me and saying.
I'll
You're going to look it
a
up?
quick second, yep.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, I'm freezing. Give me a second.
Oh, and you have a possible helper a couple rows behind you. So.
Yeah, I think I could help, probably, possibly. It's weekly, all that God has revealed, all that He has now revealed, and that He has, or
That he will yet
will
reveal.
reveal, yeah, when the great important things.
Pertaining to the kingdom of God.
Yes, thank you. Well, so this is super important, right? We should, maybe not all of us can say it right along with these two word for word, but it's something we all of us who are members of this church, it's a concept we should all have, right? We're waiting for further light and knowledge. We believe the heavens are not closed, they are open. And we believe that the president of the church can receive more revelation for the church, and each of us can receive personal revelation. So something really important to say here is that the leaders of our church have said, this is something we don't know yet. That doesn't mean we're not ever going to know it, but we don't know it yet. So this is what I would characterize our position as a very humble position. So it's a unique position, it's a humble position. Other people think they know the answer to this question. We've said we don't know yet. All right. I also want to talk about why it's a nuanced position. And that is the rest of the lecture. So let's see. Okay. So I kind of want to talk about how through the ages we've had topics that bring up the step. That's the worst beginning for a paper ever, and here I just used it in my slide. Never say since the beginning of time through the ages. That's so bad. How could I fall to such a cliche? What a bad example. Anyway, okay, so you have Roe v. Wade in 1973 that brings up lots of issues about the moral status of the embryo. So that's the 70s. Then in the 80s, you have in vitro fertilization with the very first test tube baby, Louise Brown, in 1978. Certainly then we wanted to know about the moral status of the embryo. In the 2000s, we have all this stuff about stem cells. That's when that position came out on Newsroom that said, hey, our position is that we have no position yet on when life begins. And then today, in the past few years, of course, we have CRISPR and the amazing things that can be done with gene editing. And CRISPR is a technology that potentially involves the destruction of thousands of human embryos if you're interested in doing things like gene editing to try to prevent diseases that cause terrible suffering. And so there's this question, CRISPR seems like obviously a good thing when we talk about avoiding suffering, but when we talk about it necessitating the destruction of embryos, is that okay? So that's why this is an important topic. All right, so again, spoilers, yes?
Sorry, can you explain CRISPR a little bit?
All right, I don't want to go too much there because that's a whole lecture all by itself. But this is a new technology that's come out, I'd say I think since 2014. If there are biology majors here, you can correct me on the details. But it's a huge advance. Jennifer Doudna and blanking on the name of her partner. Anyway, if they didn't win the Nobel Prize already for this, I think they did. CRISPR is an amazing technology. It has the promise that we can edit our cattle so that they don't have horns, so that we can get the Asian carp out of the Great Lakes, so that we can get rid of these single mutation, the monogenic diseases like Huntington's perhaps. So there's just huge progress here. It's just, I don't want to go into the biology of it because that's not my expertise and we could go there a long time. But the interesting thing is, it's a huge issue in bioethics because Jennifer Doudna, the scientist who was at the front of this discovery, she wrote a whole book about her worries, her fears for society, because she thinks while the science is ready, she says, we're not ready. We don't understand how powerful it is, and we have all these decisions to make about, we want people editing the human germline. That means if you decide that your child should be particularly strong, or I need to think of some single gene trait if I'm doing good biology. But if you edit some single trait in your child in the human germline, then that's passed down. So it's a decision you're making, not just for your child, but for your child's children, and on and on. And it would be very difficult to reverse, the scientists have told me. So, yeah, super interesting stuff. But today we're talking about the moral status of the human embryo. So I want to do a spoiler here why we're talking so much about in vitro fertilization when you might have thought this was going to be a talk about abortion. Here's the thing. The church position on abortion suggests a very high status, a very high moral status for the embryo, because we say abortion, that's against the commandments of God. It's very serious. On the other hand, if we talk about in vitro fertilization, you might conclude, and I will suggest, that it does suggest kind of a lower status, a lower moral status, not quite as high for the human embryo. So then we have those two views, right? It's like, well, wait a minute. If we're talking about abortion, we're saying the human embryo has this really high moral status, and if we're talking about in vitro fertilization, we're saying, well, maybe not so high, maybe destroying some embryos is okay. Well, you have a tension there. Now, I named this presentation Latter-day Saint Views of the Moral Status, but the truth is, at the end of the day, for those of us who are believers, and I am, people who are following the leaders of the church and know that they hold both, they're going to say in vitro fertilization under certain conditions is acceptable. Abortion, with a few exceptions, is not acceptable. They believe both of those things. So and they also, of course, are humble and they're saying, we don't know when life begins. So what do those three facts taken together, the humble statement of we don't know when life begins, and the abortion is acceptable maybe only under a few circumstances, and even then you better pray, you better consult with your leaders, it needs to be in these categories. And in vitro fertilization, yes, if you're using your own gametes, if you're using the sperm from the husband, and if you're using the egg from the wife, that's the particular circumstance I'm talking about. In that particular circumstance, in vitro fertilization is acceptable. It's a way to bring children into the world, according to the church. So if we try to hold all those three positions in mind at once, it starts to direct us towards thinking about what is a one position that explains them all. All right, I'm not going to try to dictate that today. My main thesis is just what you should know about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and their position on the moral status of the embryo is that it's unique, it's humble, it's nuanced. I'm going to try to explain the nuances and you see what you think it means. All right, so past the spoiler, maybe if I can make this. All right, let's go to talking about in vitro fertilization for a while. As I've said, I have quite a few slides about in vitro fertilization, so buckle up. The details are important because without the details, you don't understand the repercussions of this for the status of the embryo. So anyway, I want to point out this is from the General Handbook. If you have your phone with you, I want to point out this is something you can pull up on your phone. If you have Gospel Library, you can go to Library, you go to, well, I'm using Android, I can't help you iPhone people. You go to Handbooks and Callings, and there it is, General Handbook. It's in the very last section of the General Handbook. Scroll all the way down to section 38, and then it'll have all the moral and medical stuff right there at the end. I like to point this out because when I was a student here 100 years ago and I took my first bioethics class, the professor was kind of like, and here I have for you the handbook. And at that time it was handbook 2, and it was only allowed for bishoprics, and so he had gotten this bootleg copy for us to look at. And I always felt uncomfortable about that. Like, this is BYU, shouldn't we be following the rules here? I mean, a bootleg copy of handbook 2, like, am I going to be turned to salt if I turn the pages? So today, I'm thrilled with our transparency. You don't have to be in a bishopric. You don't have to be an active member of the church. You don't even have to be a member of the church at all to be able to see this handbook. It's on the internet, it's on your phone, everybody can look it up, and you should because they change things from time to time, so someone like me will take a screenshot and then there are new subtleties. Alright, so I made this copy this morning, so this should match whatever's on your phone, and this is notable. Because 100 years ago, when I wrote my honors thesis as an undergraduate here at BYU on in vitro fertilization, I had this big question, which was, like, is this contrary to what the church thinks is okay? Is this unacceptable? Like, I know that there are some members of the church who are doing this. This was a long time ago. I said 100 years ago. It was a long time ago. It was before it was very common. But it's like, well, I think some people are doing this, but I mean, isn't this kind of like abortion in some ways? Like you're destroying. It was a scary thing. Now, the last time I gave a presentation about this at Philosophy Club, at the Philosophy Lecture series, that was in 2017. And I don't know when the handbook I used for that presentation was published, maybe 2012. But I had to change my slides today because stuff is changing, and that's my point. When I last talked to the Philosophy Lecture series about this 5 years ago, I had a slide that said, well, because of the church's tacit approval of in vitro fertilization, because they had this paragraph in the older version of the handbook that said, well, we discourage you from using someone else's sperm or egg. So I said, aha, well, if they're going to say that kind of suggests maybe they accept some other kind of IVF. Well, voila, 5 years later, the handbook has been updated. We have continuing light and knowledge and further revelation. And so here we go, fertility treatments. They have a new section where they're explicit. It's longer than this, but I was trying not to be too wordy. The pattern of a husband and wife providing bodies for God's spirit children is divinely appointed, and this is important. This is very different than the position of the Catholic Church, for example. When needed, reproductive technology can assist a married woman and man in their righteous desire to have children. This technology includes artificial insemination and, they're so explicit, that's the point, in vitro fertilization. Now, in the second half of the statement, they go on, they continue the thing to say, hey, we discourage you from using other people's gametes. Using other people's sperm and eggs, not such a good idea. But anyway, for this, I just want to focus on this part, that they are explicitly saying in vitro fertilization, if you're using your own gametes from inside your marriage, thumbs up, check mark. That's how I read this. Right? So we're saying, yeah, in vitro fertilization is okay, it's morally acceptable. It's actually a tool. You know, it's something Heavenly Father has given to assist people who need it. Now, is that important? Well, you bet it is. Because depending what study you're looking at, 11 or 12% of us in our lifetimes will experience infertility. So look around, see how many people are here. We could count off. Say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Oh, you know, you're the one who's going to need help. Right? So I think a lot of you who haven't yet tried to have children, and in fact, some of you may be in the phase of life where you're like, I am so not ready yet. It's easy to suppose that the second you try to have children, it will happen. But the sad fact is we know that for so many of us, that'll turn out not to be true. For some of the people sitting beside you in this room today, they're going to probably assuming that it's going to work really well for them, and they're going to struggle. They're going to have relationships with their spouse for a year, and they're not going to get pregnant. And so they might want help from a fertility specialist for that reason. That's after 12 months of trying, that's the definition of infertility. And that's why talking about in vitro fertilization matters, because in fact a lot of people today need help. And a sad fact is that this number is growing. Especially male factor infertility, issues with sperm are increasing in a way that's really worrisome. Yeah?
So we've seen some of the thoughts of the LDS Church on in vitro fertilization and artificial insemination. Are there any stated standings on things like sperm donation?
Absolutely, yes. That is in the handbook. You can get it on your phone right now. The newest version of the handbook is very explicit, and I think this is important for people your age. It says, we discourage you from donating your sperm. We discourage you from donating your eggs. We discourage you from selling your sperm. We discourage you from selling your eggs. The church has taken a very specific stance on that, something they did quite intentionally. All right, so you'll notice on campus you'll see advertisements for donating plasma. You will never see an advertisement for selling your sperm or eggs, I think for that reason. All right, so back to assisted reproductive technologies. Another thing is I was updating my slides. In the past 5 years, suddenly I had to add up 1.5 million more babies to this. So 8 million total. The latest statistics are always like 3 years old. But 8 million babies born, I think up through 2019. 8 million babies born as a result of assisted reproductive technologies. That's mainly in vitro fertilization. It also includes gift, which is gamete intrafallopian transfer, but mainly this 8 million, it's almost all in vitro fertilization. All right, so the last year for which we have the latest numbers, 84,000 babies were born with these technologies. So in vitro fertilization is a really big deal, and its use is increasing at a high rate. So 5 years ago when I gave this lecture, it was 1.6% of all babies born in the United States. Today it's 2% of all babies born in the United States are born using this technology. So 84,000 babies. All right, so in vitro fertilization, I want to go over some of the details because it matters for talking about the status. So if you go through, I'm going to rush through some of this, but we do need the details. So to go through in vitro fertilization, here's the thing. A woman gets hormone injections to ripen the follicles of her eggs. What the doctors want is multiple follicles because one is not going to be enough. You need lots of eggs to make this successful. And at this point, the first test tube baby, Louise Brown, was born in 1978, so we actually have 40 years of experience. So when we say, hey, look, ripening the single egg that most women ovulate per month, that's not going to do it, we know that's not going to do it. So the doctors, if they're serious about helping you be successful in having a baby, their intent is to get as many fertilized eggs as possible. Without, of course, hyper-stimulating your ovaries, but that's a discussion for another day. So first, women go through these hormone injections, then they go through egg retrieval. If everything has worked well, there will be a lot of eggs to collect, a lot of eggs to retrieve. Then they mix those with the gametes, with the sperm, and hopefully they get fertilized eggs. Now, this depends a lot on the ages of the people involved in vitro fertilization. It works much better if you're younger. Fertility is not something that lasts forever, and I'm tempted to go on my soapbox about egg freezing, but you want to hear about abortion, so I won't. The point is this varies a lot per couple. How many fertilized eggs do you end up with if you go through this process? Well, it varies. It's not just your age, it's also your health, and some of us are just way more fertile than other people. And of course, people who are seeking help with fertility, people who are spending thousands, literally thousands and thousands of dollars to do in vitro fertilization, that is probably because there's something interfering with their fertility, so some of those people may not have very many eggs at all, and of course that's why people are tempted to use gametes outside their marriage, right? Because some people don't have any. So, they do this egg retrieval. Some people will end up with no fertilized eggs, and so then they either can quit IVF or they can purchase donated eggs and sperm. Donated is a big euphemism here. It's sold almost always. That's against the church's position. As I said, the church discourages that. Anyway, supposing you're successful and you get a bunch of eggs, usually only 2/3 of the eggs are going to fertilize successfully. Okay? And then only half of those are going to, oh, I had these fancy slides and I didn't do it right so that it shows up. Oh well. Okay, it'll be faster just to tell you. Here's the thing. Of all the eggs you collect after doing all that expensive and painful hormone stuff, only 2/3 of the eggs are probably going to fertilize in most cases. And then of those 2/3, only half of those are likely to make it to the blastocyst stage. If you don't make it to the blastocyst stage, you're not going to make it to having a baby. Now, what do couples who are doing IVF care about? Do they care about how many fertilized eggs they get or how many blastocysts they get? If you're researching IVF clinics, there's only one thing you really ought to care about at the end of the day, and that is, what is the rate of the take-home baby? Because how many fertilized eggs or how many blastocysts, if they're not successful in helping women actually have a baby, you're not wanting to just tell people you're pregnant. You're wanting a take-home baby, right? So the point of this is in vitro fertilization, although success rates are going up over time, the truth is we believe this is probably true in the human body as well, you just can't see it. So we believe that when a woman's egg is fertilized, probably a lot of the time it doesn't make it to the blastocyst stage, right? It's not that every single time that someone's going to get pregnant, right? We think this happens in the body, but outside the body, in the petri dish or whatever, as a process of in vitro fertilization, a lot of these are not going to make it. So so we're used to the idea that eggs die because every month women have a period and that egg is gone and it didn't become a baby. So, okay, that's not a big deal. Only 2/3 of eggs are successfully fertilized. We're not probably too worried about the loss of eggs, but if you look at the fact that half of your fertilized eggs don't make the blastocyst stage, if you compare this with beliefs that some people have about, is a fertilized egg alive, this could be potentially disturbing. If you thought a fertilized egg was alive, this is like a whole bunch of death when they don't make it to the blastocyst stage. All right, I better not run out of time, so skipping ahead, after IVF, most couples, 60% of them have embryos left over, right? Because the doctors in the first place, the thing they were trying to do was get as many eggs as possible, because the more without overstimulating the ovaries, because the more eggs you get, the more chances you get for fertilized eggs, and the more fertilized eggs you get, the better your chances for getting those blastocysts, and you have to get to the blastocyst stage to get a baby. So people, after they have, if they're successful, and lots of people aren't, but if they're successful in IVF, usually, well, in 60% of the cases they'll have embryos left over. On average, this is 1 to 7 embryos that end up being frozen and not used. So you might wonder, come on, if these people have been infertile and they've been wanting a baby all this time, often they're really taken by surprise, because if you've tried for years to have a baby and not been successful, the last thing you're expecting is that suddenly you're going to have a freezer full of potential progeny. Right? That's a big shock for many people who are infertile. But why wouldn't they just transfer all of those embryos? Well, there are reasons. They might decide their family is complete, like they had their 3 babies through IVF and they're done. There might be a divorce, so they don't want to have babies with that partner anymore. They might have gotten too old. That's pretty common. People don't realize their fertility is gone and they try IVF and then it's just too late. Their body won't do it. A big one in the United States, they may not be able to afford it. This is thousands of dollars per cycle if you don't have insurance that's paying for it, and lots of insurance won't pay for it. So there are lots of reasons why you might have a frozen embryo and it's not going to be transferred into the wife and the family. It's not going to become a baby that way. So what are your options? Well, you could offer the embryos to someone else. People who have religious beliefs that cause them to think of these embryos as having a very high moral status are often really uncomfortable with throwing them away. So there is such a thing as embryo adoption. You might donate them for research if you think that's a morally acceptable thing to do. That's something we should talk about more. Or you might destroy them, discard them. Probably more comfortable language is to say you're allowing them to expire. Often couples have trouble making this decision, what to do with their leftover embryos. And so it's tempting to freeze them indefinitely. I have there at the bottom, though, that indefinite frozen storage is not a long-term solution. One of the reasons for that is money. They may be charging you $500 to $5,000 a month to keep your embryos on ice. A lot of jurisdictions are worried about couples that just can't make up their minds, and there can be tension between the two members of the couple. And so they've made laws saying, hey, there's a deadline after this, we're automatically getting rid of it, because otherwise people just keep them in the freezer, so we're not going to do that. All right, so frozen embryos, how are they like stored blood? I want to make an analogy here and say, well, these embryos are like stored blood in that they're precious. You handle donated blood with extreme care. It's a limited resource. We can't manufacture blood. We can't manufacture embryos. And so you could look at this as just like blood. But one thing about blood is if we don't get it into somebody pretty soon, it expires, and then we call it biological waste. That's really different than with in vitro fertilization, because the way in which frozen embryos are really unlike stored blood is if they're frozen, they still have the potential to become a baby. Maybe your body is too old to do it, but we have people who have been unthawed and become a baby 20 years after they were initially frozen. And so this idea that you have all these thousands and literally thousands and thousands of embryos on ice, that raises a lot of questions, because those are potential babies. If you implant it in someone, there is a chance it will become a baby. So okay, now switching gears, here's the second part, and really different than the first part. I want to talk about abortion. So this is the most recent statement. You're probably aware this spring Roe v. Wade was thrown out. I saw a newspaper article that said for most women, or the majority of women, have been under Roe for their childbearing years. I can tell you, since Roe v. Wade was 1973, and that would make you 49, there is no woman in the United States who, well, I mean, assuming you've lived here your whole life, all women in the United States have been under Roe v. Wade for all of their reproductive years. So what happened in Dobbs versus Jackson this spring was a huge change. I mean, you might think it's a good thing or you might think it's a bad thing, but everyone can agree it's a huge change. So now abortion is up to the states. The climate is changing really quickly. Some of the states have laws that mean abortion is very much like it was under Roe v. Wade. Some of the states have so-called trigger laws that immediately put new laws into effect that had just been waiting for the day that Roe v. Wade would be overturned to say, okay, now we're going to have a much stricter regime about abortion. So close to home, that's certainly true. In Utah, we had what's called a trigger law. Idaho has a much stricter law than what Utah has. Anyway, as a result of this huge development with the Supreme Court, Dobbs v. Jackson, the church released a new statement in which they said, our position on abortion hasn't changed, no change. And they posted this statement. This is from Newsroom. You can look it up on Newsroom at Church of Jesus Christ or LatterdaySaints.org. Now, I would say, although they say it hasn't changed, it's interesting to compare it with the old statement. So this is the old statement here, 38.6.1. And so here we'd always start off, and I don't think they've changed their intent here, I should say, but they always started off before quoting the scripture from Doctrine and Covenants, thou shalt not kill, nor do anything like unto it. And then they say the church opposes elective abortion for personal or social convenience. Okay, so compare that with this Newsroom statement. I'm just copying this one from right here. So they start by saying the church believes in the sanctity of human life, and then they have this therefore, which I've put in a different color, because I think it's carrying so much weight. We're saying this is our reason. Why do we have the policy about abortion that we do? I'm not going to go into depth on the policy, but you can see there are certain exceptions. The policy is longer than this. But why do we have this restrictive policy, yet a policy with exceptions, which we should say compared to other conservative positions, that's different. This is not the Catholic position on abortion. Our position is quite distinct. Notably, these exceptions make it unique from other people's conservative positions. I mean, not that nobody else has some of these same exceptions, but anyway, what I want to draw your attention to is the therefore. They have added this therefore to explain the position. They start by saying, sanctity of life, therefore. Now, if you've read very many articles or philosophical works about abortion, you'll know why some of us see this as pretty significant. I'd say articles about abortion, I'm sure there are more than 2 categories, but I see 2 big categories. They're the ones like Marianne Warren, Giubilini, and Minerva, who are talking about personhood. You know, here are some characteristics of personhood. Marianne Warren has 5. They're not necessary or sufficient, but you have to have at least one of them or you're not a person. Giubilini and Minerva are kind of trying to follow John Locke. Is the loss of your aims and plans something you feel is a loss? Is that personhood? That's what Giubilini and Minerva say. So you have people like that who are setting a pretty high bar for personhood and saying, okay, humanity, human beings versus persons, those are 2 different things. And guess what? Embryos, they might meet the bar for like having human DNA, but they don't meet these other definitions, these really high hurdles for personhood we've set up. They're not persons, therefore they're not protected. Then we have a whole other category of article, most famously Judith Jarvis Thompson, who I say she's the queen of the counterexample. She's responsible for the trolley problem. Judith Jarvis Thompson, you've probably heard of her, violinist. She actually is on the same page as Marianne Warren. She doesn't believe that embryos or fetuses are persons, but she says, hey, for the sake of argument, let's go with it. Let's just say it is a person, and let's talk about what this means, even if an embryo or a fetus is a person. Do we still have to say that abortion is forbidden? Now, notably, the position she ends up with is a lot less permissive than, say, Giubilini and Minerva and Marianne Warren. Anyway, the point is, this statement by the church, if you've been reading articles about abortion, is very interesting with the sanctity of human life and the therefore, because it's suggesting a reason. Like, why is this our position on abortion? Well, sanctity of human life. And I'm not saying that you can just end your thoughts there. There's a lot more to think about. So we're philosophers, right? So we want to define everything. Let's get clear on our terms. What does sanctity of life mean? We'll skip through some stuff really quickly to get ideas on that. But basically, this statement is important because it's suggesting something about sanctity here. And this is important because, as I said at the beginning, we don't have encyclicals, right? The church hasn't given us a 300-page philosophical argument to read through. What we have is this short, the whole thing is a little longer than what I'm showing you on this slide, but 1 or 2 pages max and you're done. So we're left looking at what's the significance of sanctity of life and then therefore. So, I think this is a good time to switch to what have today's prophets said about abortion. Because the reason for talking about in vitro fertilization was to make it really obvious, I hope that worked, that it involves lots of destruction of embryos, right? So we've said if you're using gametes from within your marriage, in vitro fertilization is acceptable. Well, in vitro fertilization means the destruction of embryos. You're really not going to do it without destroying embryos. So that suggests it's acceptable to destroy an embryo. Well, when we talk about abortion, I think if you're a biology major, you might be able to tell us, I think the border between embryo and fetus is about 8 weeks, I think. Anyway, the point is, abortion depending what point in pregnancy you do it, it destroys an embryo or a fetus. So in vitro fertilization, we're saying that's acceptable. You're trying to have a family. In abortion, we are going to say, no, abortion is unacceptable. So I just want to run through these real quick. All right, so this is actually the handbook statement. We already looked at that one. So our prophet, before he became the prophet, he's explaining, well, it's legalized in many countries. We say a woman is free to choose what she does with her own body. We're free to think, but hey, we're responsible for the consequences. And then he says, this matters greatly to us because the Lord has repeatedly declared this divine imperative, thou shalt not kill, nor do anything like unto it. So he's quoting that Doctrine and Covenants, I think it's 59, section 59 scripture again, saying, hey, this is something like unto murder, thou shalt not kill, you shouldn't do it. Now, interestingly, notice this phrase, right? So this comes before he's the prophet of the church, long before that newsroom statement that came out with Dobbs v. Jackson. But the prophet, before he was president of the church, he's talking about the sanctity of human life. So if we're trying to learn about what does the church mean by sanctity of human life, I'd suggest a reasonable place to look is in previous talks of President Nelson when he starts talking about sanctity of life. And here we see it pop up as he's talking about thou shalt not kill, don't do anything like unto it. Okay, one more from the prophet, again, before he's the prophet. This war called abortion is a war on the defenseless and the voiceless. It's a war on the unborn. It's a global war. All right, so Dallin H. Oakes. The ultimate act of destruction is to take a life. That is why abortion is such a serious sin. Our attitude toward abortion is not based on revealed knowledge of when mortal life begins. So again, we have that humble thing of, we don't know when life begins. And so this is an older talk, but Elder Oakes is saying, hey, we don't know when life begins, but abortion is an act of destruction. It's such a serious sin. And okay, this is a 2-slide statement. Okay, this is Elder Quentin Cook. The others were from General Conference, I believe. This is actually in an address to the students at BYU just a few years ago. So Elder Cook says he helps us remember our compassionate side. He says abortion needs to be approved very carefully. Wise words from a prophet. This is a problem that will probably not be solved by personal condemnation or judgmental accusations. Some have cautioned to not judge a ship or men or women without understanding the length of the voyage and the storms encountered. I might add many who engage in this deplorable conduct. So it's both, right? It's a compassionate view. And at the same time, he also wants to say, this is very wrong. I won't read the second half, but that is Elder Cook. So we're out of time, but I just want to suggest the church and the leaders of the church hold both these views. So what does that mean? Some food for thought? Is it parents' intent? Is it because in the one case with IVF, you're trying to have a baby, and so that's okay, and in abortion, you're just out for convenience? But that would immunize lots of cases of abortion if you said, well, I just want to take better care of my kids that I already have, so I'm going to have an abortion, right? So intent is a questionable reason. What about implantation in the womb, right? Because in vitro fertilization, those embryos haven't been implanted yet. In abortion, they have implanted, so we could say it's that. Another possibility, the embryo's developmental stage. The church never mentions how many weeks. They don't say any abortion. Today, 50% of all abortions are medication abortions. They're happening much earlier than they've ever happened before. The church has not said, to this point, they have not said that's acceptable. They haven't made any difference between a third trimester abortion and a first trimester abortion. But one thing we can ask questions about is it developmental stage? Because in vitro fertilization, those embryos that are destroyed are all less than a week old. Women don't know they're pregnant at that point. They can't get an abortion that early. So that's my food for thought. Thanks for listening.
Angela, are you teaching right now?
No, I'm free.
And so would you mind hanging around for some questions? So for a few minutes, if you'd like to come up and ask some questions, our speaker can entertain your interests.